This is Voluntary Visions podcast, and today is Monday, September 17th, 2012, and this is an interview and discussion with Alex Leach over there in California. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Darrell. How are you?
Doing great, as you kind of well know, because we've been discussing things for a good half hour, making sure that we're all nice and casual. So I got my beautiful list of all these questions for you here, and starting off with this first one that you can answer any which way you want, which is, who is Alex Leach?
Sure. So Alex Leach is, I'm a counselor and a therapist, but I also teach nonviolent communication. So I'm based in Davis, California, specifically. And so I have a practice here of teaching classes and workshops on nonviolent communication, or compassionate communication, as it's also known. And then also working with individuals and couples specifically on working with some of these techniques and learning about conflict resolution using a certain method that encourages honest and empathetic connection. Rather than like sacrifice or negotiation, rather something that's about connecting with one another and trying to empathize and see the world through the other's eyes, and using that as a model to resolve conflicts, rather than having to buy into that there's just not enough, that there's sort of scarcity, and that we don't have enough resources to solve the problem otherwise, but to sacrifice or something, which also often leads to resentment, or it can. So that's sort of who I am right now, or a big part of who I am right now. And I'm really loving that, and it's really fun.
Brilliant. And just for folks who might not have been taking the time to listen to me ever before at all, what is NVC in a nutshell? How would you like to use words to describe it?
Sure, absolutely. So I guess I would start with, NVC, or nonviolent communication, is one model to try, the aim of it being to have honest and empathetic connection with others. So it's a way of communicating, or it's a model of really understanding the world and understanding what drives behavior and thoughts and actions, that encourages or looks towards how can we have a really observational and concrete and real observation about what we're currently doing, how our actions and beliefs are currently being driven, and then realizing how we would like them to be, that we can have honest and empathetic connection. Breaking that down, that it's a little more digestible than all that flowery abstractness. And it's really it's a communication model that emphasizes feelings and needs. So at the cornerstone of nonviolent communication is this understanding that we all have basic human needs, which not only include things like air, water, shelter, but also include things like love, acceptance, honesty, contribution, and meaning, amongst a whole other host that I'm not going to list them all here, and nor could I ever. But we have these certain shared human needs. And so that's really what's driving a lot of our behavior, right? That we act in such a way to meet needs or to avoid needs getting unmet. And that involves a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions. We get angry, we get scared, we get sad about needs not being met, and we're happy and joyful about needs being met. And when we really get at the heart of seeing that that's what's driving 90% of our interaction with other people, and then teasing that out and actually talking about that, having that layer of conversation as opposed to the more surface level conversation, which might be something like, well, that person's a jerk for cutting me off in traffic, rather having a real conversation about what's happening, that I'm feeling angry that my need for respect wasn't being met by that action. It's mine and a lot of other people's belief that if we have that more honest conversation, that conversation at the level of feelings and needs, that it opens up our hearts and our minds to connecting with others and empathizing and understanding the position of others in such a way that we can actually have connection rather than just fighting.
Where did you first hear about NVC?
Sure. So where I first learned about nonviolent communication was at actually Occupy Sacramento. So I attended Occupy Sacramento back when it the first day back, and it started in early October, and there was a woman there doing teach-ins on nonviolent communication. She was doing about 2 a day when I first got there, and it was one of the first workshops I attended there, and it totally blew my mind. And what made me latch on to it, and why I would just immediately resonated with it, was over how it could transform how I spoke to myself. So I was, and I'm still working on sometimes, very self-critical, and sort of had an internal monologue that was very deprecating. And so in the first workshop, I could immediately see how I could translate that internal voice into some of these this language of feelings and needs and observations and requests that would really be so much healthier and so much kinder and more compassionate just to myself, that I could walk around and be nice to myself and communicate in a kind way and a compassionate way with myself, and how many burdens and stress that would alleviate for me almost instantly, that I stuck around for that alone, to learn more about that. And then I co-founded with her the Nonviolent Communication Committee for Occupy Sacramento. Our mission being that we were there to help intra-Occupy conflicts and to try to resolve those conflicts using nonviolent communication, or to and then also we had a goal. I don't think we ever actually I think we effectively did that on a number of occasions. Conflicts would arise within Occupy, our committee got engaged, and we would help resolve conflicts in a really compassionate way where everyone's needs were met. What our second goal was, that I'm not sure we ever really got around to getting up and running, unfortunately, before Occupy Sacramento sort of broke down and fell apart, was we were going to try to really develop Occupy Sacramento's public language in nonviolent communication terms. That way, signages and press releases and things like that being really orientated to a sort of feelings and needs conversation with the public and with the media. That I was really excited to see happen, but it just didn't. We never got that up and running, but in time. But so that's sort of where I got introduced to it all.
And how did you learn about the Trivium or the 7 Liberal Arts?
Sure. So that was a little bit before my involvement with Occupy. I have a great friend named Morgan Lesko, who is the founder of Wiki World Order, a separate media. And he was living in Davis at the time, and we were great friends for several years, about 2 or 3 years. And he introduced me to the Peace Revolution podcast, which was one of his favorite podcasts. And quickly, episode 1, they started talking about the Trivium and the 7 Lost Arts and all that. So that's where I first got introduced to that sort of crystallization, which is what I love so much about the Trivium, is that it's a real great crystallization of the basics of logic and reasoning and how they interact. And why I say that I loved it because it was a crystallization was because what it did when I immediately got introduced to it is it resonated really well with my previous experience in doing debate in high school. So I was involved in doing a lot of debating and doing a lot of reading of philosophy, of works by Plato and Aristotle, and works by Kant, even though I know he's not he's not the most favorite philosopher out there, but Kant and Descartes and lots of other folks, John Locke, and so I was reading a lot of philosophy, doing a lot of debate, and so while I didn't have any sort of formal education, no Trivium method to really learn it, that definitely gave it it was interesting when I got introduced to the trivium because I could see parallels and what I was missing early on, but also what was already there. I just didn't have a language to talk about what I had back then, or what I was gaining from the books I was reading and doing debate. So my formal introduction was with the Peace Revolution podcast, just a few months before getting involved in Occupy. So yeah.
Brilliant answer. I'll take it back to the compassionate communication questions, which is, are people responsible for what they feel?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. They're responsible for how they feel. So in any interaction, right, or in any event, it's my belief, and it seems very true for myself, that when I experience something, I have a choice of how I'm going to react to it. And I have a choice about what I'm going to emphasize and what I'm going to let my mind get caught up in. So let me think about the example where I get cut off in traffic. So I have a choice there where I can choose to feel really angry at this person. I can think to myself, man, that guy shouldn't be such a jerk, and he should show me more respect, and really, he should have given himself more time if he was going to be so busy in the morning. And those are all choices I make, right? They're all judgments I'm making of this other person and about how this interaction should be going or is supposed to be going that's quote-unquote better. And those are all choices I've made to think like that. I've decided that I'm gonna make that judgment call about this other person. And when I make that choice to make that judgment of them, then that's when I start feeling the anger and the frustration and so forth. But I can make a different choice, right? I can also choose to empathize with myself. So I can really choose to notice that what happens in that split second that I get cut off is my heart rate increases and I feel really scared. And I feel frightened that I'm about to get into a car crash. And so I can choose to, rather than getting caught up in a sort of blaming of this other person and accusing them and judging them, I can choose to notice that I'm scared about my safety. And then when I notice that, I can choose to just dwell with that, stay with that, which means that I'm going to continue to I'm going to notice my feel of fear rise up rather than a feeling of anger. And as that fear rises up, it also diminishes as I realize that the threat isn't real and I'm not about to get into a car crash. And then I can carry on about my day. So that's what that's part of what I mean by our feelings are really part of our choice, that we're responsible for them, because I have a choice of where I focus myself and what do I get caught up in. What sort of emotions do I get caught up in? Do I get caught up in the angry judgments, or do I get caught up in what's really going on, which is that I'm just simply scared for myself? And that's what's really real in the moment, more so than a fictitious person that I'm projecting upon in this car in front of me.
A related question to this, because a lot of people certainly have made the claim that this one is so. Can people make you feel things?
Right. No, I don't think that people can make me feel anything. I think that it's all within me how I feel. I think what other people do can be a stimulus for how I'm feeling, or they can be a stimulus for and what they really can be a stimulus for is whether my needs are getting met by a situation or not. So other people can make choices that some way or another leads to a certain need of mine being unmet. So I'm going to stick with the same example for congruency right now. When this individual chose to cut me off, they made a choice that led to my need for safety not being met. I have a certain need to be safe as I travel from my home to my work, and that was not met by this other individual's choice. However, just because their choice led to my need for safety not necessarily being met in that moment, as I just pointed out, there are two ways I can feel about that. I can either be angry about that, or I could just be kind of scared and sad about that. And for me personally, when I choose to feel more sad and scared, that sort of event doesn't hold so much power and long-lasting effects throughout my day. That is to say, my whole day isn't ruined just because some guy cut me off on the freeway. Versus when I choose to feel angry at this gentleman, it often becomes sort of a downward spiral, where now I'm sort of grumpy and angry. I show up at work grumpy and angry, which ticks off my coworker, who then does something that makes me more mad, and it just goes down and down and down. Or that was a little bit of sloppy language there. They choose to do something that doesn't meet my needs, and then I choose to be more mad about that, and it keeps going down and down. So in the end, I don't think people can make me feel anyway. I think people can make choices that aren't in line with my needs being met, but that's a very different thing altogether. There's so many separations that are between the two.
Nonviolent communication seems to differentiate in a great way between strategies that you go about to find a way to connect to what you value and what you desire, which in the jargon of this science is called needs. And
Right.
there are a lot of people who get confused over that because people think of needs as these 5 major survival needs or the other very disputed Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which some people will ascribe to and say that that's verified, and some will say that that's utterly nonsense. And of course, in reality, it doesn't quite matter because unless you have no values and no desires, which I don't know how you can actually manage.
I don't know how you're going to make it through this world like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think somehow or other, it all comes down to strategies of how are you going to get, to how is your strategies working to get to those values and desires. So the question is this: it's your opinion about this concept of enemy imagery and the actual language of Jackal. Maybe you could give us some on that.
Sure. Well, I loved everything you just talked about that distinction between needs and strategies. I first just want to say there. But what so often happens, right, is that someone does something that doesn't meet our needs. And that's sort of tragic, right? And then in reaction to that, what we're kind of been trained to do by both somewhat our biology and that we have this sort of built-in fight, flight, or freeze reaction, right? So when someone does something and we feel that a need of ours is threatened, we go into a sort of knee-jerk, fight this enemy off, or we're going to run away, or we're just going to freeze up because we don't know what to do at all. But then there's also definitely, I think, a socialized component that really emphasizes some choices there, emphasizes that, well, if you don't push back and do whatever you need to do to reassert yourself, then you're just going to be a pushover and a mat that people walk upon. So there's definitely this sort of dual mechanism going on, and they're definitely interlocked and work together in certain ways that produce an effect that where when I guess I'm going to just continue with this example because my mind isn't thinking of other alternative examples where I'm getting cut off on the road. I don't know this other person in front of me, so instead my knee-jerk reaction is to go into a fright response, which is activating all sorts of things within me, both from my biology but also my socialization, where I just project upon this person and view them as some nameless black box jerk. And that's all they are now. They're the jerk in the SUV in front of me. And now and once I get engaged to that, it's very hard for me to empathize with them. So I might have a passenger in the car who might say to me, oh, well, maybe he's running late to work, or maybe he's had some sort of medical emergency and he's trying to get to the hospital, right? So I think many of us can relate to that example, where someone's cut us off and our passenger in our car has told us some sort of rational reason why they might have done that. Well, I don't really care in that moment, right? Like, I'm just so mad at this jerk in the SUV in front of me that I don't care if he's like trying to get to work or if he's trying to get to a hospital. He's just a jerk, and he should have thought of that before he cut me off. And so I'm just so cut off myself from empathizing, and I don't see the real human in the car in front of me. What I see is our nice jargon term for it is an enemy image. I just sort of, they're just the enemy, and they have to be defeated, or they have to be proven to be wrong or morally inferior in some way. And so what MVC really encourages is breaking down those enemy images. So when we get connected to our feelings and needs, and the feelings and needs of others, we can sort of break down those images, and we can see the real humans that are there, right? That the real person on the other side, and that has radical implications in so many parts of our society right now, right? I mean, just looking at politics, it's so clear that in this apparent two-party system, that one is the enemy and one is the hero in most people's narratives, if they're even paying attention, and have drank that Kool-Aid. So the party that is the enemy, it's all about just defeating them, and that means politically defeating them sometimes, but it also often we just see the sort of political fueled violence of people lashing out violently against people of opposing political ideologies, and I think at the heart of that is the sort of inability to see the other as also human. Rather, you just see them as an enemy image, that they're just this black box, bad person or bad entity, bad organization. And there's no empathy, there's no understanding, and that really results in a lot of not only verbal violence but often physical violence when it gets really pushed to the extremes. And so a lot of the project of nonviolent communication is to help people get reconnected to that empathy and the fact that there's another human being or another group of human beings they're interacting with, that carrying around with them the very same needs and feelings that I'm carrying around with myself. And when we start there and recognize that gives us a new opportunity to actually have dialogue.
The language of jackal is that's our jargon in nonviolent communication for the methods of basically producing alienation between people. And calling someone a name is definitely one of them.
Right.
Do you know any other parts about how to make sure you absolutely don't have empathy for people?
Right. Well, there are these great D words, like making demands of other people. So when I make a demand of another person, they often can get triggered into sort of a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And the reason for that is because demands are followed up by punishment often. So if you don't follow my demand, you're going to get some sort of punishment. Or even the contrary, if you do follow my demand, you'll get some sort of reward. And that sort of language where the only reason that you're going to actually do what I want is for some external punishment or reward system, really is life alienating, right? Because it doesn't speak to the fact that you're another human being, I'm a human being, and you, and I want to help you just out of the fact that we're both humans, and just out of the fact that I enjoy helping. But when you take it out of that really breaks things down. When we do comparisons with other people, that really can alienate folks. When we compare them to others, what we're doing really is we're again stripping them of their own unique humanness or their own unique individuality, and we're rather saying they either are like this other person and thus they fit into that same cookie cutter shape, and so I don't really have to talk to you, or I don't really have to listen to your arguments because you're just like these other people I know, and I already know they're wrong, so you must be wrong too. Or it's some sort of right where you're not living up to it, and because you're not as good as these other media sources I listen to, that you're automatically deficient, which often triggers a lot of reaction from people. So comparisons are another really great way to alienate people. Blaming blaming others for how I'm feeling, and that sort of rejection of responsibility, and putting it onto another person, right? So there's two parts to blaming. One is rejecting my own responsibility in a situation, which is not helpful. It's not helpful. The key reason it's not helpful is because when I reject my own responsibility, I'm actually giving up any power to change the situation. So when I cognitively check out from being responsible for a situation, I'm also sort of going into learned helplessness. I'm starting to realize that there's nothing I can do. I'm rejecting the notion that I can do anything to improve my situation, is what I'm doing. When I know it's all someone else, and so then I just need to wait around for that other person to change their behavior, which is not helpful for myself. It's life alienating to me. I'm no longer able to achieve life. But then also the second part to denying responsibility and blame is it shoves responsibility on someone else that it may not be true of them. So now this other person all of a sudden has to deal with the fact that they're somehow responsible for something that they're really not responsible for. And so now they're supposed to fix it in some way when they don't even know how to fix it, since they don't have the tools to adequately do that job, which results in a lot of frustration and anger on their end and life alienation for them. That's a couple of examples. I mean, I could sit here all day, but we probably don't want to do that.
That's okay. We can move on to the language of giraffe, which is essentially just saying how to speak compassionately to people.
Yeah. Right. So it might also be interesting to your listeners, I don't know, I'm going to quickly do a little bit of background why we use the terms jackal and giraffe, but then totally talk about what giraffe means. But the reason we use the term giraffe, for example, is there's the gentleman that came up with this metaphor. His name is Marshall Rosenberg. He's also the gentleman who started sort of this movement, but he's no longer. I mean, as much as he's still actively involved in it, there are a lot of other key players in this at this point that are in the mix and have helped it to grow and evolve and do things. But so Marshall Rosenberg first came up with this sort of metaphor of or analogy of jackal and giraffe. Giraffe language has to do with, or the reason we use the term giraffe is that the giraffe is one of the land mammals that has the largest heart. And I love that metaphor because it really gets at the heart of what giraffe language is about, which is about language from the heart, or it's about language that increases our heart size. So if you think of that great cartoon of how the Grinch stole Christmas, his heart grew 10 times too big. And that's what we're really trying to encourage in giraffe language. So what we're talking about there is language that speaks from the heart. And what I mean there is language that speaks to those feelings and needs. And there are kind of 4 key components that people talk about with giraffe language. There's first observations. So we want to make concrete not objectionable, but objective observations, photographic observations of what's actually happening. So I can, a great example of this is often we might hear, "Stop interrupting me," but already the word interruption is a judgment call about how the other person is being rude to me, and they're doing something that's sort of rude. And what might be a slightly more photographic observation is, would you please not speak at the same time that I'm speaking? And that might seem like we're splitting hairs, but what we're really doing there is that in that moment, someone could come back and say, "Oh, I'm not interrupting you." But it's very hard to come back and say, "Oh, I'm not speaking at the same time that you're speaking," when that's just what you were doing. So there's observations. There's talking about our feelings. So that's anywhere from angry, sad, and scared to happy, joyful, and excited. We have our needs. So, and that, again, is more than just our 5, survival needs of food, air, water, shelter, but also things like love and connection and honesty and comfort and meaning. And even things like play and fun and rest are great needs that often don't get overlooked, that often are overlooked in how we currently run our economies and our societies. And then the final stage of giraffe language, or the final real big key point, is requests. So as opposed to making demands that are backed up by either a punishment or a reward, we really enjoy making requests of other people. And what that entails is recognizing that all people have a need to contribute to the well-being of others. And so we want to tap into both that, but also recognizing that people want to get their own needs met as well. And so when we make requests that are strategies, requests to strategies that meet everyone's needs. So we're making some sort of question to another person that both elicits some sort of empathy and understanding that, look, we can really work together here to meet both of our needs, your needs and my needs in this conflict. If we just sort of empathize with each other and really get our brainstorming skills out, that we really, strategize and look at all the different ways and really get creative with how we can do that. So those are kind of the four big key points and kind of a survey over it all of what giraffe language is.
So that hits the major notes of it, the functional aspect of how to communicate with compassion. And that's pretty much the major topic that we're discussing. So I have all of these beautiful tangent questions that I've pretty much lined up. We're getting closer to it. You must have a small child, right? So
do I? I do not, actually. Oh. I am childless, but I have worked with lots of small children.
Oh, can you describe any of your NVC interactions with young children?
Oh my gosh! I mean, they instantly know it. I mean, they know it so intuitively. I mean, it's funny, actually. So when I started teaching nonviolent communication in Davis, outside of the Occupy sort of world, when I started doing it on my own in Davis, the initial reaction was a lot of people coming up to me and being like, oh my gosh, if you could just teach this to my 8-year-old son, or if you could just teach this to my 5-year-old daughter, my household would be perfect. And it was funny to me because as much as little kids may not use this sort of textbook kind of language, they don't say the words observation, they don't say I feel this or I need this, and they don't necessarily make the most clearest requests. When you're really listening to them, that's what they're doing the whole time, though, is that they're talking about what they're feeling and they're talking about what they're needing, and underneath that is an implicit request to you to help them figure out how to either get that solved or to celebrate it with them, that it's being solved, So it's really so enriching to interact with kids because they're already doing it, and it's great because that gives me such reassurance. My needs for reassurance and for confidence are really met when I talk with kids, because it reassures me that this is something that's very natural for us, and it's something that we have at our disposal at an early age, and then it starts getting molded out of us. And that's what I mean by, yes, there is this sort of biological fight and flight response that kids and adults go into, and when that reaction gets triggered, it becomes really, really hard for us to stay engaged at a compassionate empathy level. And that's what a lot of parents are sort of reacting to, that their kid gets triggered to a fight or flight, and then the kid's still talking about their feelings and needs, but they're doing it in a way that really triggers the adult because the kid isn't able to empathize with their parent in that moment anymore, and then it spirals out of control. And it's so, as much as there's that's very much there and biological, and we have to sort of learn how to corral. And when I say corral over eliminate it, because I don't think eliminating it is the answer either. I think there's something very useful that biological reaction teaches us. But corral it, be able to be able to use what it's teaching us rather than letting it control us. But there's also this component of the fact that we're raised in a culture of communication that's very jackal language. We're raised in a culture where the way that we think we have to communicate our ideas and the way that we think we have to communicate our feelings and needs is masked through accusations and blame and anger and comparisons and demands and all those stuff. So there is this whole thing of, well, how did we go from these kids that were talking about our feelings and needs all the time to now talking about feelings and needs is so foreign to us that we have to read these textbooks and slow ourselves down where we sound like kids saying, I feel this, I need this, and it's so silly, but it's tragic too. It's silly and it's tragic. It makes me laugh and it makes me cry that I see these kids who can do it wonderfully, and then their parents who can't, and then the parents misunderstand the kids, and the kids grow up with that, and then finally the kids rediscover what they already know. And it's great, and it's just the mystery of life.
Have you ever experienced people, I mean, usually older people, vehemently opposed to NVC as a method that could be practically helpful?
Oh, so often. It's tragically so, too often.
Can you share some or any example of that?
Yeah. So often I hear folks talk about how, the knee-jerk reaction that I get often might be that this sounds very idealistic. That, it would sure be nice if the world worked like this, where everyone could sit down together and talk about their feelings and their needs and empathize with each other. But that's just never going to happen. And what's there, often when I try to push, is just resignation. It's just sort of this, they've lived so much of their life in this jackal language. They've lived so much of their life in a sort of communication model that creates barriers and turns people off, that they just can't, they don't have the will or the energy anymore to see that another world is possible. So they've resigned themselves to that it's just a pipe dream and we can never really get there. And that's really sad, and it's sad for me because they don't seem happy when they say that to me, right? Like when I push them on it, they don't seem quite happy that that's the way the world is, but they're just sort of resigned to it. And so it's very tragic in so many ways that they're resigned to this sort of unhappy state of being, but they don't see another world as possible. And then upon occasion, what's even possibly more tragic are the individuals I meet who have gone even a step further. So they at one point got resigned to that sort of mentality that no other world is possible and this is just what you have to deal with. But now they've gone the next step further, which is that it's the correct world and that they want to live in that world. So these kind of people are folks that I meet who actively believe that they have enemies, and those enemies are so terrible and evil that to try to empathize with them would lead to catastrophe. It would lead to catastrophe because somehow empathizing with their enemies would poison and bring themselves down, right? So like let me make that a little more real, and I'll use myself. So if I empathize with the CEO of Bank of America, somehow that's going to make me worse of a human, and somehow I'm going to become, if I try to understand and empathize with the CEO of Bank of America, somehow that's going to poison my own moral compass, and I'm going to agree with him about some things, and because I agree with him, somehow that's going to make me worse off. Let me not empathize with that bank CEO, but rather let me just eliminate him or something really horrible. And so that's the even more tragic situation I come into meeting sometimes with people who have resigned themselves, or it's not even resignation, it's embracing the concept that there are enemies out there, and those enemies are so evil that there's no point in trying to connect with them, and even doing so would be a bad thing in and of itself. And that's a really tragic situation for me to hear, because for me, that really doesn't create or envision an inclusive and caring world that I want to live in. So breaking it even further down, that means that my needs for care and concern and compassion are so unmet when I interact with those people, and when I hear those types of messaging, that I just am left feeling really sad and even feeling hopeless sometimes. If the room is crowded enough with those people, I'm feeling really hopeless at the end of the day, and but again, all that's about me. So tying it back to what you were saying about responsibility, that's all about me, right? Like they're not doing anything to make me feel hopeless. It's just the fact that my needs for inclusiveness and care and empathy aren't met by those messages. So for me, I feel sad when I see those messages. There's a real breakdown of what's happening in that interaction. And it stops there, right? So, yeah.
That was almost my biggest downer question that I had saved for you. So I'll switch it up with a different one here. Have you experienced any times where you were able to help people who at first were vehemently opposed to NVC as a practical thing in their life? Have you helped any folks see that there are practical applications to having a connection?
Yeah. Yeah. And those moments, I'm going to get to a concrete example in a moment, definitely. But I just want to say on top that those moments are just so beautiful. And the hopelessness that I was just describing in the previous situation gets completely wiped away when I have some of these moments that I'm about to talk about. Where I see this most clearly happening is with couples. And so I might be working with a couple, and often it'll be the masculine partner in the relationship. And I want to say the masculine partner because I don't mean the man. I mean an individual in the relationship who is taking on really a dominant, aggressive, more, how to put it, someone who's communicating out of strategies and real hard facts and figures to the detriment of feelings and emotions, where that world, they've cut themselves completely off to that world, which can happen in biological males or biological females, but it often is the more dominant partner. But anyways, so that partner will just, when I introduce the concept of, well, why don't you tell your partner right now how you're feeling? Are you feeling angry right now? Oh, yes, I'm feeling angry. Okay, great. So you're feeling angry right now. But what's underneath that? Like, so are you, when your partner doesn't clean the dishes, are you also just sort of sad about that? And then the sort of reaction is to be like, no, I'm not sad, I'm angry. I just told you that. And what do you mean sad? And why would I tell you about that? And this sort of repulsion to the idea about that I have feelings, and if I communicate those feelings, I'll actually probably get the empathy and understanding I'm looking for. And so then slowly, as I work on, what it really comes down to is trust. What gets people from that place to the other side, in my experience, has been working with trust. So having them start to trust myself, to start to trust their partner by seeing their partner and myself conveying empathy, right? So empathizing with wherever they're at. So if they're just at that angry stage, just keep empathizing with anger. And so it's like, yeah, I'm really angry at my partner for not cleaning the dishes. Wow, I can just feel how infuriated you are right now, and how your blood pressure is just rising, and you're probably feeling really hot. And then that moment when I say that, the person can feel that connection, right? So they go, yeah, that's exactly how I'm feeling. And once I've used that empathy to establish trust and connection, so now they're feeling, wow, this person really gets me. They understand what I'm feeling. And when they feel that, they can often trust me, that I can trust this person. And once I've gained that sort of empathetic connection and trust, slowly but surely, more and more they're willing to communicate about what's really going on for them, what they're really feeling underneath that anger, and what needs are driving that. And then the real turn-on moment is when they've gotten enough trust, they've gotten enough empathy going that they're willing to talk about all that, and then they do it. And then there's the moment after they do it where there's sort of like this tension in the room where they've just been vulnerable about what they're feeling, which they hate doing, and now their partner can respond. And then the beautiful thing happens where their partner understands with compassion and understanding. And then that moment, the initial person who never had any interest in nonviolent communication really sees how when they open up and are vulnerable, they get the understanding and compassion that they were looking for the whole time. And so then, boom, they're off, and they want more NVC, and they want to use it as much as they can, and it's really awesome. But it really takes a lot of work to get to that point sometimes, because it really can take a lot of setting aside one's own fight-flight reaction and being willing to empathize with someone, no matter what they're sort of saying or where they're at, but providing that safe space for them to be vulnerable, which is hard.
That was a great story and a good answer. And
well, thank you.
This next one is going to go back to an ancient topic for you, possibly. What is your opinion of the Occupy movement and the Occupy philosophy today, at this point of your knowledge?
Well, that's a great question, and I will say that I would just want, for clarity's sake, my involvement with the Occupy movement ended, and I would say it ended a little bit either early or either late February 2012 or early March 2012. So just for clarity's sake of listeners, anything post-March of 2012 has merely been me looking from the outside in. And so a lot of my experiences prior to that period of time. I think the number one tragic thing within the Occupy movement for me was the lack of empathy and understanding. So there was a lot of anger in Occupy, and a lot of anger at the CEO of a lot of large banks, to the point where what I really wanted to do, and so I was a member of the Nonviolent Communication Committee with Occupy Sacramento, and a lot of what I wanted to be doing in that committee was working on public language and how we interact with media and stuff like that. And the reason I wanted to work on that was because I was seeing so much really angry messaging getting out. That angry messaging was turning people off from coming to the event. It was turning people off once they got to the event, and it was encouraging certain actions that I wasn't comfortable with. So there was certainly that going on, which I found really tragic. I mean, to the point where I heard people openly advocating using violence to oppose CEO bank people who they had never met, never knew anything about, but had become these sort of black box enemies of, well, who's the real enemy? Well, it's the CEO of Bank of America, and if we can just get him, then all our problems will be solved. And that was really tragic for me, because it really lacked understanding of the issues for me intellectually, so my needs for understanding weren't met there. My needs for compassion and care weren't there, that this person, when stuff like that was advocated, that there wasn't really an acknowledgement of the humanity of this other human. Now, that all being said up top, I will say that there were lots of things that I really found life enriching about Occupy. There were so many needs I found met at Occupy that I was engaged for a long time, from about October 2011 to March 2012. having needs about, so just to start off, when I first got there, there was such a mentality of do-it-yourself, of DIY, that you got there, and if you were upset that something wasn't happening, the reaction wasn't, well, you need to go somewhere else. The reaction was, well, why don't you make it happen? Like, so like, if you would like to see something happening here in this movement, please jump in and start doing it, which leads to potential problems for sure, but I really enjoyed that sort of mentality of just do it yourself. Don't wait for some sort of leadership to start that project and then you can volunteer on that project down the road. Rather, why don't you start the project right now and find some other people sitting around you who want to also work on that project to just get it up and running, and and then figure it out later. And while there's somewhat that led to some sort of, some projects that maybe weren't fully thought through properly, it did lead to people getting actually engaged. And so people were actually doing something as opposed to waiting to be told to do something, which I found really exciting. I also found that the analysis at Occupy was a lot better than the analysis of what was going on. The analysis of the political system was, while it wasn't perfect, it didn't meet all my needs for shared reality and for completeness. It was much further down the road than many of the conversations I was having with coworkers and friends at home, right? So I was meeting lots of people that were recognizing that the two-party system wasn't working. They were recognizing that both the Democrats and the Republicans are just there to confuse and distract us from what's really going on. People there who were very adamant about not allowing the movement to be co-opted by a certain political party, which I found refreshing. That is to say, they weren't interested in endorsing a candidate or endorsing a ballot measure. They were really working within the movement to prevent Occupy from going down that road, and sort of getting back to this sort of nonviolent resistance to the machine, and using that as sort of, we're just going to start to walk out of your system and we'll develop our own system. So, there were, free schools there at Occupy Sacramento where people just brought books and shared books and had workshops all day there. You had our own medic tent where our own medic system was going. We had food that was linked to a farm in Sacramento. While not all our food was coming from that farm yet, that was sort of the idea that eventually we could get onto this whole other alternative food system, and so it was a great way of what I really view political change now is that we outgrow the system, right? We just move outside the system and we develop our own systems that work better than the current system, and just by the sake of them working better, people will flock to them, and as long as they're not immediately squished by an iron-footed system, if they're allowed to flourish, people will flock to them, and they'll just naturally replace whatever currently exists. So I did find some of that to be there, not enough that was ultimately successful, and the fact that it still existed in a system that did come in and squish it, in some ways that I saw that happening. So, that's kind of. What Occupy is doing now is hard to say how I feel about it because I am so far removed. But that was my experience of it while I was engaged in it, and I do want to say wholeheartedly that it gave me a lot of tools, such as nonviolent communication, to work with.
Excellent. Getting closer to the end of my questions, what have you learned about the concept of voluntarism, and how is that relevant to nonviolent communication? Yeah.
So, interestingly enough, I think I first came across just the term voluntarism. I think a few weeks into being engaged at Occupy with a friend I had met at Occupy sent me a link to the Wikipedia page on voluntarism. And so that's where I first got introduced to that specific term. And it's a great term, and I think that whole system of how we run things is a really great system. I think how it relates to nonviolent communication, well, so getting back to the fact that a key tenet or a key part of this discussion and within nonviolent communication is this idea of radical responsibility. So it's my responsibility to own up to my feelings and needs, and to own up to these are my preferred strategies, and these are my requests, and these are my observations. And it's all about speaking from a language of I. I see this, I feel this, I need this, I would like this. And what that really speaks to is the fact that the only frame of reference or the only perspective I can speak from is my own. And the only ownership I have over anything is over me, is over the I statement. I can't control others. I can't control how large corporate entities act or do business in the world, or how large organizations conduct themselves. But I can control how I act and interact with the world, and how I choose to get engaged in it. And so I really appreciate that sort of honesty that I think really ties into volunteerism. So the only way volunteerism really works is if people are really honest with themselves about what they want to see happening, and then are honest with themselves about the fact that they have power to make that happen, and then to go out and do it. And the only way we can be really honest with ourselves is if we get in touch with our feelings and needs. So the more and more we deny those feelings and needs are going on, the more we're dishonest with ourselves. So the more we think that it's someone else's problem, that it's the corporation's fault, that it's the bank's fault, that it's the politician's fault that society is the way it is, the more I deny the fact that my world isn't as enriching and amazing as I want it to be, because of feelings and needs in me. And my needs aren't met in these ways, and that's resulting in these feelings. So once I'm honest about that, and when I'm really honest that it's really these handful of, 5 or 6 needs maybe that aren't getting met in my individual life, then I can get into the real work of finding ways that I can meet those 5 or 6 needs. And thus my personal little world can become just as life-enriching and awesome as I want it to be, as I'm hoping it can be. So I think it's tied in. I think the two are tied together through this sort of radical responsibility. I think they're tied together through this sort of honesty that they both require. And finally, what they're really tied together over is the fact that that volunteerism really engages the fact that I want to voluntarily interact with other people, and I want to voluntarily have connection with certain people that I volunteered to connect with, and to really do that in a way that is voluntary for both parties is to do it based on feelings and needs. So as long as I'm using demands and comparisons and accusations and blame, like maybe I'm making a choice there, and I am making a choice there of how I'm choosing to interact with this other person, but I'm also stripping the other person of some of the safety, to the safety they would like to have in order for themselves to feel like they can choose how to interact with the world and volunteer how they would like to. So I'm taking away some of their safe space. Maybe that's a better word for it. That they may like to have in order to feel like they can volunteer themselves fully. And so there is this desire I have that if we communicate about feelings and needs, it really frees us all up to actually be more voluntary in our interactions.
Brilliant. So here's the interview flip-around question, which is, this is your chance in the midst of the interview. Ask me any question you wish on any of the related or unrelated topics that you'd like to. Here's your chance.
Great. Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'm really curious about I'm really curious because I know that you're interested in nonviolent communication. And so I'm really curious if there was something in your own life that really... So, like, for me, it was about the sort of self-critical monologue about really initially got me into nonviolent communication. And it was like, once I saw that I could change that, I totally wanted to be part of this whole thing. So I'm curious whether you had anything in particular that made NVC look appealing, or as opposed to any other model of communication, or if not.
Sure. It does very much for me start with getting a practical application of the trivium. And for me, that was actually starting to see that everyone who was intact, children, animals even, I saw evidence of the trivium, that of where the little creature or the little person would first be trying to understand every individual part empirically. They would fully try to understand it without any biases. They would just understand, and they do their grammar. And then they move on when they learn that magical question, why? Which goes on to logic and starts to remove all. If it doesn't remove the contradictions, at the very least it isolates them for later removal if possible, so that one thing can only equal one thing. And when people go into voluntarism, they eventually learn a way to do this by removing the euphemisms of what they call statism, which is a way of thinking. And by removing the euphemisms, a tax merely becomes theft. Or, what can I say, an enforcement of dues paid where the service is not really required to be provided. Which, of course, you would just call theft, if you just remove it. And so that's nice and logical. And then the practical application is rhetoric for me. The rhetorical triangle and the work of Jared Sanchez really helped me with this one. He does the Trivium binder, which at blogspot.com, I believe that's the place where you can find it. But a certain Google search on Trivium binder would certainly find it. And it was through that I first started understanding the use of the rhetorical triangle, that of understanding the author of the message, the audience that the message is intended for, and the message itself. And it was an understanding that, and then the around that triangle is the context of how within all of that is supposed to be based, all what's going on around all of the author and the message and the audience. I realized that the author and the audience, there was something between them too, and that was essentially the actual feelings that are going on, because unless they're dead, they have feelings. Right. And then the actual values and desires that are unfortunately unconsciously motivating those feelings. And it's the lack of awareness, both of these methods, of the trivium and of their motivating feelings, which are, like you mentioned, they're completely just, they are an aspect of the manifestation of how well the strategies are going. The strategies that are there to meet the specific values and desires. And I do drop to using that term because I know I can be more clear with my language. I use the term needs and feelings when I'm speaking to NVC people like you, because just like if you were an Oriental medical practitioner, I would be speaking in Oriental medical terms. It's our shorthand. It's our jargon. We get we get so much across so quickly that way. Yeah. I don't know who exactly I'm speaking to. I'm not really a prolific podcaster in any way, and so I'm mostly just I'm trying to answer you. Like, this is where I'm coming from. I saw it as a very compelling thing, incredibly useful in every single possible way, starting with myself, where I realized that I myself was out of control in the feelings department, and I needed to understand the best way to deal with it. And it wasn't going to be a Zen pushing it down and clenching out forgiveness for people, which was an ephemeral thing. There was not even a definition of what that meant. I had such a problem with that. Now I understand a little bit more about it. It just means that it's coming to the same perspective that I would see a clear-thinking animal like my cat do. For the most part, there's no grudges for the past. There's only the present moment, and everything is being reacted upon based upon what's likely to happen, based on experience.
Yeah. Right.
The feelings are genuine. And as with children, too, the feelings are genuine. My daughter's 16 and a half years old right now, But I did go through my first, her first 12 years. I lived in proximity to her. I split with her mom when she was, I guess that would be like 3 years old, and I pretty much did see her 3 or 4 days a week from then on till when I moved here. I got to experience what happens when a little one is given lots of choice and volition, that autonomy, which, is the major subject of what voluntaryism, or what can I say, voluntary individualist ways of thinking. That's a good way of saying it. That was my nice convoluted answer to your question, I think.
I loved it, though. I thought that was great, because I think there was so much in there. And what I really loved hearing was how you found it to be so much more authentic than other ways of communicating, and it really met so much of that need within you. And that's so true, right? That this method of communicating feels so much more authentic because it opens us up to be vulnerable with one another, which is where it gets real.
The final concept that I would add to it, and that it's an allegory that I keep thinking of, is these two functions of creating bridges of empathy, which is generally the goal, and then also seeing the barriers to empathy, which is being observant and astute. So I get to see the applications of those two things. If I understand how well my lenses are working, like if I really... the trivium doesn't work by itself. And so far, NVC doesn't work by itself. They're totally dependent on how well am I actually applying the methods, which requires that I look at how well I'm applying the methods.
Right.
Also, it's, as I was just discussing philosophy deeply last night with someone, it's very important to understand that I don't make an assumption that I understand reality. I'm only understanding reality through my lenses.
Right.
And I choose my lenses purposefully. But many people do not. They assume that they're fully experiencing reality. They are not aware of which lenses they look through, and they could not describe the lenses themselves.
Right.
So you understand what I mean. Lenses meaning I'm looking through the trivium, and part of that trivium, inside of the rhetorical triangle, I am looking through the lens of feelings, and then behind that, the values and the desires and the trajectory of life that the person, whoever it is going through. That's a vision that I have so far.
Yeah. Oh, that was so great for me to hear. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing all that. And I think you're so right. And that's partly what I mean by all I can control, or all that I have mastery over, is the I statement. So all I really have control over or mastery over is the lenses that I'm viewing the world through. And whether those lenses allow me to feel empowered and feel like I can make change and feel like I can connect and communicate effectively, or whether those lenses lead me to feeling like I'm disempowered and that I have no control and learned helplessness and I'm disengaged from the world around me. And so I think that's a great parallel between what I was talking about and what you just spoke to, which is this, which is just fantastic. But,
thank you.
But yeah, so it is fascinating how I think what both of these tools, the trivium and nonviolent communication, allow for, right, is for they help us to get back. And it's a return. It's a return to when we were less corrupted, as you put it. I think I'm not sure that was the exact word you used, but that was the word I'm going to use. But less when we were less. It is a getting back to less corrupted, but it's reawakening. Both these tools are great because they help people reawaken to the power that they already have, the ownership that they already have over themselves, that they voluntarily. Incidentally, they voluntarily have given up over to some other power, whatever type of authority power it is that's dominating their life. And so it's funny because then they can just as easily voluntarily take it back or or realize that they've had it the whole time. And I think you also nail it. Something that came up for me as you were talking was there's also a third type of person I interact with that are very skeptical about nonviolent communication. And this third type of person is someone who comes up to me and they talk about how, oh yeah, I used to use nonviolent communication. I used to be really engaged in that world, but I found it just never worked. And when I pushed on what do they mean by it never worked, what they mean is that when they use the words, I feel this, I need this, can I make a request for this, the conflict didn't magically go away. So when they use this method as like a magic wand, similar to how you can use the trivium sort of as like a magic wand, well, I'm going to talk about the grammar and the logic and the rhetoric, and somehow that's going to magic wand make my problems disappear. They found that it didn't do that. And then they get frustrated because it didn't do that. So there is this element where you have to actually engage in it and realize what's really going on, and what's really at the heart of both the trivium and nonviolent communication. And it's not about, certain words we use that will make all the difference or sort of magic wand effect. It's rather about shifting your whole perspective, shifting the lenses that you're using to view the world, that you are now using a whole new mindset and a whole new set of lenses that allow you to feel empowered and engaged, and giving up lenses and mindsets that lead you to not being so.
Well said.
Yeah.
And what would you say would be the single most important concept that you'd like to leave all the listeners with from this interview?
Well, the single most important concept, I think at the cornerstone of nonviolent communication, and something that I have harped on from the beginning of this talk, has been about feelings and needs. So, if anyone is interested in learning more about how they can use nonviolent communication in their life, there's tons of resources that they can go to on the web. You just look nonviolent communication up, go to maybe the Center for Nonviolent Communication.org, and there's just a plethora of information about how you can get into this. But if you just wanted to start today, getting more engaged in this process right after ending this talk, listening to this talk, is just starting to ask yourself, anytime you notice your emotions shift, so what am I really feeling here? And then asking yourself, well, why am I feeling that? And then if the answer is something like anger or frustration, I even challenge people that they push themselves a little bit further and ask, well, that's probably because I think things should be some other way. If things shouldn't be that other way and they just are the way they are, well, what am I feeling about that? And what am I needing in this situation? And I think those two questions are really some of the more foundational questions just to get people started on the path of getting reconnected with themselves and reconnected with people around them. So if people just start going around and asking, what am I feeling? What are you feeling? I think that would be great as a next step.
I agree. Hey,
yeah.
Would you like to tell everyone who would like to learn more about Alex Leach about, say, your website or, for example, your YouTube channel or any other places where they could learn more from you specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for reminding me that I could plug myself. So there is kind, K-I-N-D, communication.org is my website. And that's where you can find information about me. You can find information about how to contact me, what I do here in Davis, and I have even attached to that a bi-weekly newsletter that includes in it little videos of me talking about different little topics. I make 5 to 10 minute short videos that go into each newsletter that goes out. And so that then leads you to my YouTube channel, which is also Kind Communication. And there you can find a whole plethora. There's an hour-long talk I did at a Students for Sensible Drug Policy conference where I'm relating NVC topics to the war on drugs conversation and how we can have a sort of conversation about ending the war on drugs using nonviolent communication. But then I also I have several other videos just about how you can use nonviolent communication in your life and break down some of these basic concepts and explain those. So those are two great ways to find out more about me and nonviolent communication from my perspective, how I use this lens.
And that is my excellent interview with Alex Leach. And this has been Voluntary Visions podcast, and I will be posting this as soon as I absolutely feel like it, given my own personal situation nowadays. Today, again, is Monday, September 17th, and wishing you all pretty damn good voluntary choices out there.